Hi, everyone. Sol here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Today, I'll be presenting on how to develop a product roadmap. Let's start the slides. Real quick, funny story about this first slide. So I originally had a meme that was very similar. It had a dog, and it also talked about not knowing where the product roadmap was going. Unfortunately, our legal team reviewed it, and because we couldn't attribute the picture, I was told I couldn't use it. So I asked if there's anything I could do, and they said I could use a picture of my own dog. So this is my dog Mochi, to introduce everyone to him. And so this was my own homemade meme, and I thought it was kind of funny that I couldn't actually use a meme from the internet. But with that, let's get started. So let's jump into a little introduction about myself, just so you know who I am, what I've done, where my experience comes from, and also my connection to the Madrid campus. So I'm a technical lead at Loon. If you don't know, Project Loon is a Google X project. Our mission is to deliver connectivity to the world. And so what we've done is we've developed technology that allows us to have balloons that create a network above remote areas to provide internet. So the main use cases for that have been during disaster recovery. So in Puerto Rico, after hurricanes, we would deploy our balloons and provide internet to the citizens free of charge at that point to help everyone. In addition to that, my experience with Google for Startups, if you can see the picture on the screen, luckily this time last year, I was at the campus with a bunch of other Googlers who were advising startups as well as working with the startups in the residency program. Hands down, one of the best experiences I've ever had. So definitely miss everyone in Madrid, miss the food, miss the experience completely. But in addition to that, I've also worked at a number of startups. Some of you may or may not have heard of. I've worked in fintech. I've worked at B2B, B2C, social media. I've even worked at Google with our material design team, which creates a open source design system for anyone to use to help organize your data, organize your websites, your applications. So my experience across different areas of products, engineering, startups, wearing multiple hats. I would say that I am by no means an expert in any area. I'm a jack of all trades, but I think my experience has really shown me the different areas. And with startups, I've been able to really understand that in a startup, you have to be dynamic. You'll have to always be willing to kind of like think outside the box, and you'll always be tested to do something that you've never done before. So with that, let's jump into the content. So the first thing I want to do is make sure we kind of all talk about what a product roadmap is. So I pulled some definitions from the internet. This first one describes a product roadmap as a high-level visual summary, talking about your vision and your direction. And the other part I highlight is communicating the why and the what behind what you're building. So this is really a good kind of like the bolded points here are really what I kind of think of when I think of a roadmap. It's basically something that should be visual that you can kind of point to, you can look at, people can share with one another, and they can discuss. In addition to that, you're really trying to define the vision and direction of your product. And this is over time. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to show where you are now, but where you'll be 6 months from now, potentially a year from now, and as your startup grows and succeeds, even 5 years down the road. This other definition I think is really important is a statement of intention. So the biggest thing about roadmaps, I think a lot of people have difficulties thinking about is how final does it have to be? Like, can I put a product roadmap and share with people if it's not completely ready? And my kind of like guidance to most teams is really that we're talking about a intention. So this is what you intend to do. Obviously, things change. You'll learn about your users. You'll learn from feedback. The world may change. We're in a really trying time right now with the coronavirus and a lot of political unrest around the world. And you as a startup will have to pivot and adjust to that. So what your roadmap is really describing is what you intend to do if nothing else changes. But I think the biggest thing to remember is that things always change. And then this last one is really, I think, kind of interesting and somewhat ironic, is that it's not literally a roadmap. When you think of a map, especially things like Google Maps, or if back in the day you had paper maps, those are static. They kind of stayed in place. Like things don't move. Like the locations are still where they are. Hundreds, thousands of years. And a product roadmap is not static like that. A product roadmap has to be dynamic. It has to be able to flex and change based on your needs. So remember that your roadmap should reflect what you're going to do and reflect what you need to do. Okay, the next section is really going to be on a part that I think is probably the most important, which is who is a product roadmap for? This is really talking about the audience and kind of like, I think, aligning what their requirements are for you as a producer of a roadmap, but also what are you trying to communicate to them? So making sure that that alignment is there. So short answer, a roadmap is for everyone. What I've broken that down into is 4 main categories. There's your team, there's other teams, if your organization is big enough, there's your users, and then I also put a special category for investors, executives, and kind of like high-level sponsors of your project, your work, things like that. And I think these 4 kind of encompass the different areas and different motivations of why people want to see your product roadmap. And so for each of these, they have different questions they want answered. And so your job as the producer of the roadmap is how do you align the information so that you're giving them what they need in the right format. So the first one we'll talk about is your team. So your team wants to know, what are we working on next? Do our customers want it? And do I believe in the strategy? So I typically think that your team is going to be the most critical of your roadmap. And I think that's actually a good thing. They're going to be the ones that are the closest to the product since they're building it. They're going to be the ones closest to the users because they're hearing feedback directly. And they're also the people who are sitting, shoulder to shoulder with you every day. And so I think what you really want to do is answer all of their questions and make sure that they believe, or at the very least, that they understand where things are going. And so what you'll want to do is make sure that you answer these questions for your team. But what I'll also say is that these same questions may not be applicable to everyone else. And so what you're going to try to do is develop something that answers the questions for the right people. And so you as the owner of the roadmap will have to kind of like decide what to share and when. For example, other teams are going to want to know, again, what you're working on next. When will it be done? How will it affect our work? And do you need our help? So this is really about having that visibility into your work and understanding dependencies. So I think that goes both ways, where you will depend on them, they'll depend on you. So you'll want to make sure that you can communicate where you guys are going, what your requirements are. And obviously things will change and things might have to change for them or change for you. But the idea is that how do you communicate that effectively? And then there's your users. Your users are going to want to know what's coming next. When will a feature I want be available, and should I switch to something else? So really what they're trying to evaluate is, does your product satisfy my needs now as well in the future? You might have a product that is really great and people love it right now, but they'll want to know in the future, will it still continue to be that great product that is better than all the other products? So what you're trying to do is make sure you're always showing that future to them, where it's like, yes, stick with us, continue using our product, and it's just going to get better and better over time, especially if you're product that people are paying for. If people are paying for it, it's even more reason to know that, should I continue paying for your product, or, are there other products in the market that could also serve my needs? And then last group is the investors. So the investors, really what they're thinking about is their money. They want to know if you're the right team, the right group, the right startup to invest their money in, and continue to invest their money in. So they're trying to understand, like, have you thought things through? Do you have a plan to basically reach break even, profitability? Will you give them the return on their investment they're looking for? So with that, you're kind of trying to figure out how to convey that high level detail to them so they know what you're doing. But at the same time, if you think about the first group, your team, who want to know basically, hey, what are we doing next month, next week? Investors aren't going to really want to know at that scale or that level. They really want to know at a much longer term if you know where you're going. So what does that mean? One visual way to kind of look at it is your team is going to want tons of details. And so I represent these little blocks here that really kind of show, you have some long-term projects, smaller term projects, you have things that are dependent on each other, you have things that'll be worked on in parallel. Other teams are going to want to know probably a subset of that. They just want to know kind of the high level themes that you're working on to understand how to plug in, how to support you, as well as how you will support them. Your investors are going to just really want to know basically some tactical, strategic things that are going to basically convey that you have thought things through, you have a strategy, it's backed up with research, things like that. And then lastly, your users. Your users don't want all the minute details of your sprints, of your tasks, of your milestones. They just want to know, when will the feature that I want be ready? And so this kind of shows the different breakouts based on your kind of audience, how much detail you show them. So if you think about this, once you create a really detailed product roadmap, you can then kind of slice it up into different views. And so I've worked with teams where we basically create an extremely detailed roadmap with all the tasks, all the projects aligned with our sprints, tagged to different resources. And then we start to break those out into high-level themes. And then we kind of create different decks, presentations for the different groups as necessary. So with that, let's talk about what a product roadmap actually looks like. So I grabbed a couple examples here for us to take a look at. Here is one that's basically, the main things that I want to point out here are kind of like the delineation between different work streams. So here we have, for a web team, we have a mobile team, and we have a marketing team horizontally. And then vertically, you'll see you have months, January, February, March, and so on. And what you're trying to do is create this visual representation that has some color coding that helps organize the information, but also creates a quick, view, especially for people who are just skimming this over. So someone who is, say, from the mobile team, or someone from the marketing team, or an investor can kind of look at this and quickly look at the parts that they care about and skim over it, and then kind of drill into detail. So this is a great way just to kind of understand what's going on at a high level. The next one here is just another view, again, similar kind of like layout. This one a little bit more color coded horizontally, and you can also see they have a bit more dependency. So the call out here is that when you're doing these visual representations, a lot of what people are looking for is understanding kind of like the logical progression. Not only when will something be delivered, but also when will something be needed for something else. So when does A need to be done so you can start on B? And so this one does a good job at kind of showing different blocks in different sequences. Okay, so that kind of talks about what a product roadmap is, why it's useful to different audiences, and you as a producer of a product roadmap, how can you support them by creating this? So I really want to get to the next part, which is kind of like describing how I've created roadmaps. So definitely want to say, first off, is that this is how I've done it. It's not the only way to do it, and there is probably no right way to create a roadmap. I really think what you're trying to do is create a system that works for you and your team. The biggest thing I've learned with working with so many different startups, both advising startups outside as well as the ones I've worked for personally, is that it's highly reflective of your team and kind of the way you guys think. So what you're trying to do is take the way you've thought things through, the research you've collected, the process you've adopted, and now turn that into something visual that people can understand. So I'm going to start off right now that I am a very literal and a very simple thinker. And so with that, the way my biggest tool for using roadmaps is spreadsheets. So I use Google Sheets extensively to basically think through and organize my thoughts. And in this case, organize my roadmaps. And so what I'm going to walk through is actually an evolution of a roadmap that I've actually built recently with my current team at Loon. And so I'll call this kind of phase one. And phase one is resources and tasks. So when I joined the team, it was a really small team. We just had a couple engineers, and there was no roadmap in place. There were some loose requirements. And so the first thing I did with my team once we got established is really just to kind of like align our resources and tasks. So the biggest thing here is just understanding, hey, who do we have available? What's the timeline? And when do we think certain features will be available? So you can see here, I did some color coding, obviously, so I could look at different features. We tried to estimate as best as we could. Again, this was a very new team, so we had no real idea of like how long it took to do something, but we wanted to like start doing some estimations. And so the first week we had a feature that we thought we'd get done in 1 week, but obviously it took longer than we expected, and then kind of like moved into the second week. But the second week we were able to split that up between 2 people. And so between 2 people, they worked on 2 different features, finished one, and then the person could start in the second one. So again, this was extremely reactive, and this would change, kind of week after week. We would change the ordering of things. Sometimes we'd move features up and down, but this was our, what I would call, first stab at, it's hard to call this a product roadmap because it really isn't a roadmap at this point, but this was for us the start of that. The next one was the next iteration, which was feature delivery. So you can notice that we've taken out the resourcing. So I cared less about like who was doing what exactly. And what I started to do with the team is talk about, hey, we have these X number of features that we want to address, over the next, say, period of time. And what we started to do is we thought about, okay, how long will it take to do each feature? When will it be delivered? And what's the sequence of that? And so this was really nice way to communicate to the team when features would be worked on. And then people could actually pick their features. And so this was more kind of like empowering for the team to understand, it's like, hey, we want to get these features done in this time frame, and we just need people to figure out what to do. So trusting your team to then figure out what to work on. Then things got a bit more complicated, but you'll also see our timeline also went out, increased as well. So one of the things that we started to do was look at a much bigger scale. So less about weekly cadence, and now we started looking at a monthly. And so you'll notice that each month we started to kind of figure out where would we be working on different parts of features. This was also, you can kind of tell that features start to get a little bit bigger here too. So now we're talking about less task-based features and more around like functional areas of like, hey, this feature has some back end, has some front end implementation, and also think about launching. I can say right now, the one thing that typically engineering teams, and I'm guilty of this, we forget to do is factor time for the actual launch itself. So we think about all the coding that's required. We think maybe about testing even, but then we forget, oh yeah, we actually need to launch, coordinate with marketing, and all the little pieces that required. So this was starting to get a little bit better at understanding, okay, how much time do we need to do the different parts? And you'll see that in this case, I kind of showed different ways to break out the different features. You can talk about front end versus back end. You can talk about web, iOS, Android, different platforms. And the last one, actually, I would say is definitely much more kind of like startup that I'm familiar with, is thinking about things like from a prototyping, from a MVP, betas, getting feedback, and then think about launching like publicly. So you can kind of think about how to break these out. Again, the color coding helps, the timeline kind of helps to like figure out when things will be done. But ultimately what you're still trying to do is show overall progression and always be willing to react. So I can tell you right now, all the graphs typically change every, I would say, 1 to 2 weeks as we learn more information, as the team comes back and figures out how long something really takes, how difficult something really is. We either are able to accelerate certain work, or we have to potentially put in more time to get things done. And then again, the nice thing is that when you do that, you can see how that affects the rest of the timeline for your work. And then ultimately you get a better sense of, when things will actually be delivered. And then this is kind of like what I call the external view. But for me, on my team in Loon, this is kind of what I use to communicate both to other teams at Loon as well as to kind of like our executives as we're talking about kind of like our releases during different quarters. We kind of bucket all the features that we think we want to deliver. This has been agreed upon between engineering, design, product management, and then what we're trying to do is really organize those around our releases. And so I think this becomes a little bit more kind of like what people are used to seeing as a roadmap. It's like, hey, for each quarter, what are the deliverables that you're going to be shipping to our end users? And so that way, your end users know what they're getting, the investors know, where you're heading, and your team kind of knows what they're signing up for. I think this is where you start to, potentially get a lot of feedback about how we're going to do that, how is that all going to happen, and that will be what we cover next in what level of detail should be in a roadmap. So I think this is the interesting part, which is everyone always asks me, how do you decide what to put into a roadmap? I kind of call it the Goldilocks rule. So you never want to be too high level and you never want to be too detailed. You want to be somewhere in the middle. And the biggest thing to always realize is that there's going to be questions because even if you put all the detail in the world, there's going to be some detail that you left out and somebody's going to want to know. And so what you're going to want to do is really kind of find that middle ground to communicate the basics. And then have discussions with people. You're going to want to discuss with your team in detail. You're going to want to spend a lot of time understanding what their questions, what their concerns, and generally how to like make them feel comfortable and ultimately confident about the direction that the team is going in. The team should be visual, like I've shown in these examples, but there's going to be a lot of details behind that, and that's where working with the team. Working with your designers, working with the product managers, with engineering, you're going to start then having the details that fall out from that. So that's going to include requirement documents from product managers. It's going to include design documents from engineers, mocks from design. From the team itself, it's going to be figuring out more of the detailed roadmaps of detailed timelines of like, okay, when will the team be able to work on this? What's the sequence of needing the mocks, doing user research, user feedback, maybe a prototype that we ship to a small limited set of users, looking at the analytics for that. That's where the details will come in. And you don't want to try to get to that with a roadmap. The roadmap should be, again, high level, that it shows kind of like when something will be worked on, maybe tag all the people who will be involved with it, but then trust them to then figure it out. And also trust them to come back and be like, hey, you were thinking that this would be done in a month. The reality is that this is going to take probably 1 to 2 months to get done. And then that's now going to be feedback into the roadmap. That'll change the timeline. You have a choice then to either cut scope to make that same timeline or extend the timeline and potentially push something out. And so that's that discussion you're going to have. And then the last bullet point here that I really think is really important is about how you spend your time. So one of the things I always talk with my team is that we should never spend so much time maintaining our roadmap as opposed to producing the details. So those things I talked about, design documents, product requirements, mocks, sprint planning, that's where like the bulk of your time should be put. The roadmap should be kind of like what is used to guide a lot of that. So you want to make sure you're not spending endless meetings, arguing about, it's like, oh, is this going to be 5 weeks or 6 weeks? Like, that level of minute detail should be done at the kind of like execution team level, not at the roadmap level. So as an owner of a roadmap or a participant in creating a roadmap, you want to kind of like give that feedback and make sure that you guys are investing your time in the right places. I realize I skipped over one thing, so I'm going to go back real quick. Let's see, back here. One thing I wanted to talk about with the audience and the different teams is actually how do you kind of like align around what the roadmap is. And so one of the things I want to talk about is actually with the structure of thinking about these different audiences is actually creating these different views I mentioned, presentations of like, what you present to your team versus other teams, investors, and even your users. And so what you're trying to do is, once you create your detailed roadmap, is then break it up into the different pieces so that you can review with these groups. And again, that's where that kind of like back and forth goes, understanding, what their concerns are, their questions, and then taking that feedback and then again, iterating on your roadmap. I think for my teams, we typically look at the roadmap definitely every quarter. So beginning of the quarter, we will, or actually right before the beginning of the quarter, we'll talk about planning for the rest of the quarter and see if that still aligns with our annual planning that we've done. And I think for startups, you probably don't have a annual roadmap or annual plan, which is totally fine. I think what you're trying to do is, again, go from, that if we look at my example here, you're looking at that like weekly view for the next like 2 to 3 weeks of what you're working on, and then slowly trying to increase that to then monthly, quarterly. And so, when you start out, what you're trying to do is just get the group used to thinking in terms of time, because I think a lot of startups, they're so focused on the current, the right now, and that a lot of times you kind of lose track of the things that you're working on or that you need to work on in the future. So the idea is to kind of like make sure they feel comfortable with like, planning for next week, next month, and eventually next quarter. And so as a product owner, what you're doing is trying to give them that structure that they can do all of this. So we're actually ending a bit earlier than expected. I think I probably talked a little too fast. So I always like to end my kind of like presentations with this reminder: new ideas are welcome. There are no final answers, especially for startups. Like I mentioned before, you're always having to basically adapt and be dynamic with your audience, with your users, with your teams. So with roadmaps especially, I'm still always constantly learning. I'm always still curious how other teams kind of like operate, how they use them, how they develop them. So I'm always willing to learn how you and your teams are working on them. But definitely take everything I said as kind of guidance, as examples of how I've done it, how teams at Google, at different startups have done it, and then kind of figure out what makes sense for you and your team. And with that, I think we can move on to Q&A.
Hello, can you hear me, Sol?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, sorry guys, we had a technical problem. Again, there's people in the chat saying that it happened in the morning, which from one side we are sorry for that. The other side, it's good to see you again here. So yeah, I'm glad you introduced yourself. I think it was a very productive session. So the idea now was basically to answer some of the audience questions. And one of them, the first one, is what do you consider to be the main difference between a timeline and a product roadmap?
I think that's a really good question. So I think there's a lot that you can kind of assume are very similar between the two. A timeline and a roadmap, they both have a time component of understanding, like, over the next X period of time, what will be worked on. I think timelines typically are more kind of like program management and understanding like the dependencies of like when do certain resources need to be available to do certain work, as opposed to a roadmap, again, is a bit more high level, where you're talking about when will certain features be delivered, when will certain milestones be met, and it kind of covers up a lot of those details. So if I had to describe the difference between the two, is timelines are more detailed and product roadmaps will be more high level.
Okay, thank you. And another question we have here is how to align these roadmaps between teams with different schedules.
Yes, definitely. Bigger startups and bigger companies, I can tell you Google is one of them, aligning these very large teams, sometimes hundreds of people, can be really difficult. I think it's actually, the funny thing is that it's not so much aligning roadmaps, but it's actually the first step is actually building a roadmap. Each team, as they develop their roadmap, as they go through that process with their teams of understanding when things need to be done, that actually is a great way to start to communicate your needs and your dependencies on each other. So when two teams can bring their roadmaps together and talk about, hey, we're going to deliver this feature at this time, you can now start to see kind of like where those dependencies happen, and that's where that alignment then kind of can be done. I think a lot of times it's not really a question of will you align, because you have to align if you're going to be able to deliver something successfully. So develop the roadmap, bring it to your partners and stakeholders, and going to have that discussion.
Okay, so I'm assuming follow-up question on that would be that in the end, after you trying to align all of these teams' roadmaps, you end up having, let's say, a higher level roadmap where all the dependencies are already accounted for, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's where typically there might be one group or one team, or maybe there's like another, like the executive team that kind of owns the broader, large scope roadmap. The other part that I sometimes talk about with the roadmap is people typically ask about OKRs. So if you know about objectives and key results, that's another kind of like tool to help kind of guide. There are subtle differences between OKRs and roadmaps that I picked up on, but I think it's again trying to figure out like who owns which pieces, and then kind of like combining those into a larger vision.
Cool. You just answered one of my questions I had here. Exactly that. So we had a very interesting session early this week about OKRs, how to define them, and how to attribute responsibility to each team member. So you kind of answered already, like one could basically derive or create a product roadmap out of the annual OKRs that the company already defined, so that you have like all of these dependencies and responsibilities assigned.
Yeah.
So another question we have here is, how do you track versions at the sub level, so features level, across an engineering team based on your experience?
So I've definitely had some different experiences, and again, I think this one depends on the team and how much time they're willing to spend on tracking and keeping up with their different roadmaps. So I've had teams who we basically create snapshots of our roadmap, and we basically will kind of like create a copy of it before we make changes to it, so we can kind of see those versions as they happen over time. And then I think, again, just the way that roadmap is organized with like the timeline, when you make changes to it, you can kind of quickly see the effects of one piece slipping or one piece being done faster on the rest of it. So you can kind of see that and communicate that out to the team. Another good mechanism is actually doing presentations. So definitely, I think if your organization is big enough, or maybe even if your team is a small team, doing regular roadmap reviews. So maybe like once a quarter, where you kind of like go through the roadmap, talk about like the next 6 months, potentially even talk about the last 3 months of like how did we do compared to our original roadmap, is a great way to kind of like talk about those talk with all the teams about the progress that you guys have made. And then I think, again, on the engineering side, I think one of the things that is always a question is all the details of the roadmap. And that's where I think you're not going to capture like sprint plannings, feature, requirements documents, technical design documents inside the roadmap. But I think that's where you'll have those documents that live outside of the roadmap.
Okay, cool. So we have another question: where do you put big ideas or long-term features? So where do you assign, where do you store the big ideas or the long-term features you have planned? Do they belong in the roadmap or somewhere else? I'm thinking about probably moonshot ideas, kind of associated with the product development.
Yeah. So definitely with my team, we typically have, I think, two kind of like long-running work streams that we have in our roadmap are around kind of like, big ideas, bets, kind of like research, R&D work that we want to do. And then the other one is actually tech debt. So we typically try to show in our roadmap, if we have technical debt that we want to clean up over time, we'll kind of have that also laid out. It's great to kind of show, when that's going to be worked on in comparison to the other things. And then obviously everyone's going to want to know prioritization. It's like, oh, should I be working on this core feature that we want to deliver, or can I start working on that R&D project that we think we'll need a year from now? And so kind of like having the roadmap laid out to show that, I think, is really helpful. And I think that's also back to the topic of audiences. that's something that makes a lot of sense to share with your team internally, but you probably wouldn't share that with your investors and your end users, because that's kind of details, and you might be showing them things that they don't need to know yet. So again, think about who's going to be viewing it and kind of share the right view to them.
Okay, makes sense. So I think you mentioned already that you use a lot Google Sheets to control your roadmaps. People are asking if you use any other. I'm assuming your favorite one so far is Google Sheets, the one you use. But do you recommend any other based on your experience out of Google, other companies you have been using product roadmaps?
Yeah, so definitely I would say for me, my favorite tools have been Google Sheets and then Google Slides. And that's not just because I work for Google. I think I really like the flexibility of just basically free form, being able to kind of like organize things the way that I want to. I think a lot of the tools I've used in the past around roadmaps, things like Jira, Confluence, wikis, things like that, they typically kind of like enforce a structure. So if you want to follow a process and structure, another good one that I know a lot of teams work with, oh shoot, I forgot the name of it. I'll try to remember it, which are very prescriptive. It's great for teams that haven't done the exercise of roadmaps before, and want to kind of like, maybe follow some best practices. But for me, I think with my teams, a lot of experienced engineers, designers, product managers, we just tend to want to have more freedom and control. And so being able to organize things in something like Google Sheets, so you can move things around, and then, basically copy that and or create, pretty slides they can then share with investors or other groups, I think is just a great tool for flexibility. And then I've also worked at companies where we built our own internal tools to track our roadmaps. So, they want something integrated with our bug tracking solution, or they want something integrated with our marketing comms. So I think there's, definitely different ways and different flavors. Again, I would defer to, sit down with your team, talk about their experiences, what they've done, what they want to see from this, and then figure out what the best tool is that meets their needs.
Okay. So I have a question. So assuming a very recent company designing the product roadmaps for the first times, what do you believe to be the most common mistakes these teams will make? Like, will they mismatch on resource allocation, as you mentioned before, that you plan a task to last for 2 weeks and you end up using 2 months to do it, or misestimations of requirements needed or resources needed? What's your advice for smaller teams that are now planning their first roadmaps?
Yeah, I think those mistakes are all mistakes I've made multiple times, because I think with every new team, you kind of go through a lot of stumblings and a lot of mistakes before you get things right. So definitely can say, don't feel bad if you ever experience those things. They just happen. I think the one that I see with basically all the teams I've worked with is the one comment I mentioned about kind of like thinking that the roadmap has to be perfect the first time it comes out. It's a lot like product development in general. Like when you build a product, it's rare that you build the perfect product and launch it, right away. And I think the roadmap's the same way. I think teams will sometimes take too long before they publish a roadmap. They will sometimes think that they need to have like a 12 to 24 month roadmap implemented. And I try to I tell them, even if this isn't to be shared with anybody other than like the 2 people creating the roadmap, like put something down on paper that you believe in and that you can stand behind. And I think that's kind of like step 1. And then once you're able to do that, and then share that with a slightly bigger audience. So now share with your engineers, share with your designers. You'll see that feedback. You'll see the mistakes, that you're going to make, with estimations, with prioritization, with dependencies. But then you'll make it better. And then once you make that better, you'll have, the next version. And then if you keep doing that again, just like product development, you'll start to build a good rhythm, a good pattern of developing kind of like a good plan. And then everybody kind of like everyone's going to want to see that plan more often. And then you'll spend, hopefully, not a lot of time, but you'll be spending more time kind of like planning further out. So, this week you only have 2 weeks. In a month, you have 2 months. In a couple months, you have 6 to 1 year. plans and places. So my biggest advice is start small, start early, and start sharing quickly.
Okay, strong advice is there. There's a follow-up question from the audience, which is, so still focus on a very small team like a startup. Who is responsible for creating the product roadmap? Is it better to have a marketing or business-oriented profile, or more tech profile, or more techie profile?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't know if there's actually a great single answer. I definitely think it's going to be depend on each startup. What I will say is I think whoever has the time and the knowledge to create one, I think definitely no one should ever feel like because my role doesn't have the word product in it, if I'm not a product manager, I shouldn't, care about the product roadmap. I think that's the biggest mistake. It's anybody who cares and wants to start thinking about that and start making that plan. They should feel empowered to do it. And I think the company should also encourage them to do that. Because when you have someone from engineering, start creating a very technical roadmap, while that may not be the perfect roadmap for the entire company or startup, it's a great perspective, that the marketing people wouldn't be able to do, or that the product people wouldn't be able to do. And then hopefully when they see the work that the engineers put into it, they'll start to then layer on top of it their own requirements, their own product, roadmap pieces. And then suddenly you get something that, has engineering, has marketing, has product all together. But I will say, I think ultimately it is up to the product owner. So I think in startups that can be potentially the CEO, the founder, that could be a product manager if you've hired someone, that could be your lead engineer, lead developer. So I think it kind of depends, but definitely having an owner is really important. So you'll want to kind of like establish that pretty early as well.
Yeah, I think that based on the experience we have at Google for Startups, and you have been as well as a mentor. Of course, in the beginning, when you're talking about like 5-person team, then it's pretty common that you still don't have your PM, and that probably the CEO or the tech lead will be kind of the only one in charge of these roadmaps. And as a final question. It's basically recommendations. So is there any books or resources that you usually recommend for people that are currently with the challenge of building or managing a roadmap?
Oh, I wish I'd included a couple links, actually. There's a couple books that I think most product managers like that I've worked with have all recommended, and I think are good places to start for understanding the product lifecycle. And I think a lot of principles about like planning out product roadmaps. I don't have them on me right now, but I can update them in the slides, and then we can share that out with everyone.
Sure, perfect. I mean, this video will be available for everyone afterwards. So we also share this extra information and resources that you send us.
Yeah, that'll be perfect.
Okay, so we have no more questions from the audience. So I think it's the last words. I just want to apologize in the name of Google for Startups once again for our issue with the initial connection. And also thank you very much, Sol, for being part of the program. And we will have next sessions, product focused, next Friday morning at 10 a.m. Spanish time. And they will be held in Spanish. So Sol, thank you very much. And we end up our session here.
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending. Really appreciate it. Sorry I went a little bit fast. And just a personal message to everyone. I know it's a really trying time with the coronavirus and everything going on in the world. I hope everyone is doing well, and I, definitely also want to offer my support and help. If there's anything I can ever do to help anyone in the community, please reach out. I would, if it's to hop on a chat to help you with your startup, or if it's just to kind of like talk, I am definitely here for you guys. So definitely let me know what I can do.
Thank you very much for your availability and support. And thank you everyone for watching, and have a good afternoon.
Yep.
Good morning.
Bye, everyone.
For the US. Bye.